Have you ever had that experience where a wee little innocent thought enters your mind and then it starts to repeat? And then it's not so innocent anymore because it repeats again and again and again. And then another thought comes in and starts to roll around with it, and then it spins and it rolls and it spins and it gets louder and louder and louder until it becomes freaking torture and you can't stop it and you just wish that it would shut up. Yes, well, if you've had that, I've had that, and I had some wonderful, fortunate experiences that helped me learn how to turn down the volume starting with a very, very simple brain exercise. So I'm going to share that brain exercise with you today. I'm going to give you a number of variations that I've cooked up over the years since that I started using it, and then I'll show you how to apply it to the next level. So if you want a brain exercise that will allow you to take those nasty, repetitive thoughts, turn down the volume, and maybe turn them off completely, today's little bit of ataraxia, as you might call it, is going to make your head spin in a good way, of course, because it's going to go down into the spin cycle and then down, down, down until that little final beep on the washing machine, and then you have peace. Oh, such wonderful, lasting mental peace. Hey there, this is Dr. Anthony Metivier from MagneticMaryMethod.com, inviting you to get subscribed. If you're new here, we talk all the time about brain exercises, memory exercises, and what it takes to become our highest possible selves, literally better living through better memory, through better mental states. And for the love of memory and those better mental states, hit that thumbs up and let's get started with the brain exercise we're talking about today. It is called number skipping. Now, where the heck did this come from? It came from this beautiful little book here called Happiness Beyond Thought by Dr. Gary Weber. Now, I was very, very fortunate that somebody recommended this book to me, and I almost ignored it. I almost said, no, I don't want that. That's not exactly what I'm going to do with my mind, governor. But I'm glad that I said yes to it. And if you want the full context of that, you can watch my TEDx talk where I tell the story of how I overcame my own snotty arrogance and ignorance and almost didn't explore this most extraordinary set of brain exercises. So what is this? Well, it's very simple. It's so simple you might almost dismiss it. And it's the idea that you count from 1 to 10 and you suppress the even numbers. And then when you count on your way back down from 10 to 1, you suppress the odd numbers. So what do we mean by suppress? One of the things that we find very, very extraordinary about thought, and this doesn't happen to everybody, so if you're one of these people who already has the miraculous ability to silence your thoughts, bravo, you're very, very lucky. And if you had to earn it for yourself and you did it a different way, please share in the comments so that people have many more resources that they can follow. But I think a lot of us, when our thoughts get rolling, it's very, very difficult to stop them. And that's because we don't have a means of suppressing thought. And why don't we have a means of suppressing thought? It's because we don't even really know what a thought is. So the beauty of number skipping is it helps us start to understand what thoughts are. And then when we have a better a grasp on this material of thinking, so to speak, then we're able to play around with the dials and change the nature of thought and whisk a lot of it away entirely. So number skipping is suppressing numbers and going from 1, skipping 2, actually skipping may not be the right word. You're just acknowledging that there's a space for 2, but you're not representing it. Then you go on to 3, you don't represent 4, you go on to 5, etc. And then on the way back, you say 10, you allow yourself to mentally represent 10, but you suppress 9, you allow 8 to come, suppress 7, etc. And you just go forward and backward. Now, in the beginning, I found this extraordinarily hard to do. If anything, it was impossible to do because I had the don't think of a red cat situation. So if someone says, hey, don't think of a red cat, probably the first thing that you're going to do in order to understand that sentence is you're going to think of a red cat. How could you negate something in your thoughts if you don't think about the thing that you're negating? Now, again, some people say, well, that's no problem, I just didn't, right? And if you're able to do that, again, bravo, please share with us your strategies for that. But most of us, I think, probably we are going to produce the thing that we're trying not to think of. And that's what makes this exercise so extraordinary, is that you're acknowledging or you're somehow producing a thing without producing it by skipping the numbers. Now, where is all this going, this idea of skipping numbers? And it's just that simple. You think of 1, you suppress 2. You literally work at not thinking about 2, even though you know you're counting from 1 to 10. and then you allow yourself to enable 3 to arise in your mind, and then you don't enable 4 to arise in your mind as you go to 5. And you take some time to experience that empty field of non-representation. Where's it all going? Well, a lot of what Gary Weber is doing in Happiness Beyond Thought is literally trying to get you beyond thought. So what would that mean? Well, it means negating the very notion of your identity, this I, the sense of a me. And not only that, he goes a little bit further and talks about negating the whole idea of the body, right? And you want to do this because where does your suffering come from? Your suffering comes from being separate from the rest of the world because you think that you are different than your mom, you're different than your uncle, you're different than the president, you're different than the king, or whatever. Like all these separations that we make are made because we are differentiating ourselves at the level of identity, the I, and the me. And at some level, we're forced to do this. It's not like we live in the Matrix or something like this, although in some sense, that is what we live in. We live in this sort of illusory world where because our license plate says, you know, this is your car registered to you, well then that must be true because it's also linked to my license for driving the car in the first place. And that is linked to this birth certificate that has also been given to me since I was born. And again and again and again, you're given your name, and this is all instituting itself in a large social program for you to be you. And it could get even more insidious than that. I mean, we think about the Matrix, but what about Spartacus? Spartacus, who belonged to a group of gladiators who thought that they were lucky to be slaves who went and fought in the arena. And often that happens to us too, is that we're so associated to our identities as belonging to a particular nation or what have you, and that we're somehow lucky to be in the servitude of the establishment and the maintenance of this great state of affairs, right? Well, are we? Or is that just creating more suffering? Is it helping us create the very prison that we wish that we could escape? So, when we're able to see how these things are formed in our minds and maintained by our minds, then we're able to start chipping away at them. And the number skipping exercise is a great starter exercise where you can begin to see how our thoughts are formed and where they're formed in consciousness, and then how they can be, so to speak, unformed. And you know, it reminds me of the opening of the Iliad. Of Peleus' son Achilles sing, O Muse, the vengeance deep and deadly, whence to Greece unnumbered ills arose. So we're going to unnumber our ills with the number skipping exercise. I think I got that quote right, if the gods of memory were with me. Now, speaking of unnumbering things and unnumbering ourselves and unnumbering the suffering that we have, this is a negation exercise, and it can be a little bit spooky for people to start to realize, hang on a second, I'm participating in the construction of the thoughts and there is no I to participate in it in the first place. What's going on here? It can be a little bit destabilizing. So you want to do this with caution. Maybe you need to speak with someone if you have a counselor or a psychiatrist or anything like that. If you're at all worried about messing with the nature of your consciousness, get it checked out first. And if something does happen, there are organizations like Cheetah House who can deal with an awakening, because there are sorts of destabilizing things that can happen when you mess around with meditations like this. Because at the end of the day, this brain exercise is kind of like one of many possible meditations. And these can help you start to experience states of consciousness that might pull the rug out from underneath you. It certainly happened to me, and I went around in a little bit of a funk for a couple of months actually, because I was just like, this is all a construction of my mind at some level. And at the end of the day, it's not necessarily all a construction of your mind. It's not that all of life is an illusion, or that you're participating in a game that makes you a slave, etc. It's not that easy. Nothing is as easy as it ever seems, no matter how much you think that you have peered into the nature of reality, etc. But this is just a nice way of beginning to engage with the nature of thought and be a little bit unbothered by it. And let me tell you, this isn't new with Happiness Beyond Thought, or new with anything really. This goes back to ancient times. You know, the ancient Greeks had the idea of the epoché, which is the idea that, we can really distance ourselves from what's in our mind, and we can bracket the material that's in our mind, and then we can rotate it in our minds without judging it. And they also thought that this would lead, if you did it well, to a state of, I think the word was ataraxia or ataraxia. And this is being unbothered. This is being very still and peaceful for long periods of time. And you see many, many variations of this throughout many, many traditions. And it even became a little bit of a science at some point in the late 19th and early 20th century through a guy named Husserl and the school of Phenomenology. And basically there, he reused this term epoché and thought about bracketing our experience and thinking about everything we could do to remove our biases and our assumptions to focus on material that appears in reality. And what do we mean by things that appear in reality? Well, for example, you would look at the number 2 on this card, and then to bracket it off, you would say, okay, so this is a piece of paper and there's some black material that has enabled me to see the letter 2 on a white background. And you might spin it around and go, oh, isn't that curious? I've never seen a playing card with the number 2 on it before. And then you would reduce all judgment. So you might think, oh, I hate magicians. They're so silly and ridiculous, those crazy magicians. Can't stand them, right? Oh, well, there is a thought, a judgment. So we're going to put that aside and maybe think about, where does that judgment come from? What's the historical basis for that? And what in my personality would allow me to ever have such a thing as hatred, and so forth. And then we're going to continue focusing on the phenomenon of this card and its nature, and try to bracket off as much material as we can to just think about this thing in itself and all that it might maintain. So the squiggly line of the 2, which is differentiated from 1 because 1 is just a straight line, and so on. And you just go through as much as you can to bracket it all off and really, really focus on the thing in itself as it is without your judgments about it. The next step in the phenomenological school would be to go to an eidetic reduction. So now we've looked at this card with the number 2 on it and we've reduced it to what its elements are. Now we're going to look inside our minds and say, okay, so what is the mental object that we've just arrived at? So we have things like a card. We have things like black on white. And then we want to look at all of those mental materials and think about their nature. So what does it mean to think about a white field, right? Well, I don't know. You have to explore it. And then you have to think about all the things that come up there. And then you might think of things like containment. So there's a card, right? But in your mind, there is no card, but something in your mind is containing that field and separating it from everything else. So there's card, not card. And then there's black ink and there's not black ink. And your mind is somehow fusing these things together so that now you have black ink, not black ink on white field, as opposed to the rest of the field around it. And you're distinguishing these different things. You're making a mental object and you're framing in different ways with a kind of binary, is there, isn't there, and then in a frame, not in a frame, or somehow boundaried or not boundaried. And the more you dig into this, the more you have this strange and wonderful experience of what it means to have a thought about something in the world, right? And then again, you do this without judgment. You're just trying to be scientific about the production and the appearance of your mental productions as mental objects. And, whether or not this leads you to lasting mental peace or not, I don't know. But this is essentially very similar to what Gary Weber is talking about in Happiness Beyond Thought. And it's very, very similar to what ancient Greeks did and many, many other traditions, is to try to think very, very scientifically about what is in the mind. And there's a wonderful line in a text from the Ribhu Gita that says, Atmajanam Param Shastram, which means the science of consciousness is the ultimate science. And at some level, I think that's very, very true. What science could you do more directly than an inquiry into the status of mental objects in your mind? Not just the objects in the world as they appear in your mind, but the very ideas about those objects as they appear in the world in your mind. And that's what we do with number skipping. So let's do some number skipping together and think about it and ponder it. So the basics are very simple, as I've described. You count from 1 to 10, but you skip certain numbers. And it's kind of hard to describe this. You got to play around with it yourself. But literally, counting 1, as I did it in my practice when I was first starting, I arrived at this pattern, which is I would go 1 on an in-breath, and then I would do it again, 1 on an out-breath. And then when I breathed in the second time, I would just allow nothing to come. But I would have this kind of mental marker, as if I was going from left to right and thinking about where 2 would be. And then on the out-breath, same thing, just nothing. And focus on this. And it failed most of the time for a long time. Just this kind of, well, I'm not thinking of 2, but then by not thinking of 2, I would actually be thinking about 2. And then I'd move on to 3 and go, okay, so 3 and 3. And then move to 4, but not represent 4. Practice not representing 4. And here you get this idea of what it's like to do this eidetic reduction. What is exactly going on when you represent a 4? And as you pick around and you poke around, you begin to see that you could actually start to suppress this. You could make it possible to experience the space in which the 4 would appear by studying it against the field or the background of when you allowed the 3 to come in. And the more you poke around with this, the more you're then going to get to the next levels that Dr. Weber is talking about, which is the suppression of all thought, allowing yourself to just be the field in which thoughts appear. So you've got to play around with this, and using the breath I found was very, very, very helpful. And also thinking deeply about what is the nature of this imaginative space in which numbers appear at all. So one way you can really help yourself with this is to close your eyes while you're doing it. So you're 1, and allow yourself to think about like that shape. What does a 1 look like? Now, if you're struggling with this idea of how you're going to represent things and not represent things in your mind at the same time, you can get started with just some simple index cards. So what you can do is write the numbers 1 to 10 on cards, but insert blanks between them. And then you can sit in a meditation pose or in a chair or whatever you feel comfortable with and look at the number 1, represent it in your mind, and then skip it manually in your hands by going to this. So now you might already be thinking 2 ahead of this. Study that. This is the whole point of the exercise, is to study what's happening in your mind. Why does your mind already start to produce the 2, right? Well, part of it is that you've been conditioned in the same way that you're conditioned to, go and take your birth certificate before you go and get your driver's license and then use your driver's license to help you get a license plate for your car. Like, this is all automatic conditioning. You've been taught that this is what you do and how you do it your entire life. Well, it's the same thing. Your mind just automatically produces the number 2 because that's what comes after 1, right? But does it have to? Well, this is the same thing when you have thoughts that you don't want. Why do the thoughts come to mind? Because you've just been conditioned to have thoughts all the time. But if you start to break that and interrogate it, well, this is one way to do it. Because now you've filled in the blanks already, but you've encountered a blank. So you think both about what is it in your mind that caused you to automatically fill in those blanks, and then what is the nature of the blank. And then when you're done investigating that and exploring it, then you allow yourself to take a break and you do 3, right? And now you can compare and contrast that state of the automatic filling in versus just willingly filling it in. And then you go on to the next one and you should have a blank. And then you can continue to explore what happens there. And I've already just been practicing here and I didn't represent 4 all of a sudden. I knew the blank was coming and I represented the blank, which is very nice. So it's not that nothing's happening there, but now we're just going to skip and then we go on to 5. Right? And you can keep doing this with this manually, but you want to get it to the point that you're doing it with your mind as soon as you can. Now, another way that you could really help yourself get into an exercise like this would be to do some mind mapping and to think deeply about what each individual number actually means to you and different associated ideas so that you're getting more used to mental representation that will then help you have material to study the absence of representation. So on this simple mind map, I just drew the number 1 here in the center. And then I thought of how many different things can I think about for 1? And so the first thing I thought about was Bono singing the song 1, and that's in the band U2. Then I thought of 1 by Graham Priest, good book. Then here, a definition of 1 is very simple. Not 2, right? So that's kind of an interesting one. Then I have a car here, which is a Formula 1 racing car. Here I have a fantasy kingdom here, castle, which is, once upon a time in a fairy tale. And here I have the Three Musketeers. I'm not an artist, by the way, but to me, that's the Three Musketeers. All for one and one for all, right? And then here we have a train track. Again, not an artist, but, one track mind. The train here is supposed to have a brain that's exploding with too many thoughts that it wants to get rid of because it's a one track mind. And then here we have a really poor artistic rendition of a guitarist in a one-man band, right? So those are different things that one can represent. And they're all mind mapped out to show multiplicity in representation. And then another thing that you can do to practice experiencing the field in which representation appears is to unnumber or undo your mind map. So let's say you've drawn a mind map like this for the number 1, and then you want to erase it mentally in your mind. So you study it a little bit, then you bring it back in your mind with your eyes closed, and you think, okay, so I'm going to erase this number 1. And then you can actually erase things out of order to do the number skipping. So I remember that my number 1 was Bono. I'll erase him. I'll skip number 2 and I'll go to the idea, my third idea here, which was that 2 is not 1, and I'll erase that. Then I'll go back to Graham Priest's book number 1 and I'll erase that. Then I'll skip over to the Formula 1 racer and erase that, and so on, doing it out of order. You're skipping the different stations. And this will really help you experience this representation, then skipping a representation, and then going back to what you skipped to represent it, and then erase it. Another variation on this exercise that you could try is instead of going from 1 to 10, you could skip around numbers a different way. So you could go from 1 to 100, and then go 2 to 99, 3 to 98, 4 to 97, and so forth. Or you could do it 1 to 99, 2 to 100, 3 to 98, 4 to 101, and you can skip around numbers, all sorts of different patterns, and just make up different patterns for yourself. 50 to 1, 51 to 2, 53 to 3, etc., and play around that way. Or you can go 50, 51, 49, 52, 48, 53, 47, 54, etc., and you can skip around that way. Now, you're not actually skipping any numbers, but you're just skipping around the number representation system, and you could also try it with skipping. So you could it just stretches your mind to figure out how you would do it. But you go say 50, 52, 49, 54, 47, I've already screwed it up, 56, this sort of thing. And this is a really wonderful thing. And then you would do it backwards. And, it's a great challenge, but it's another way of skipping around the numbers, representing, not representing, going in different directions at the same time, experiencing the directionality of representation in your mind, but always fundamentally asking, how is this represented in my mind? Where? Do I have a sense of where in my mind this is represented? And can I actually track it? And the more you work on tracking it, the more you stretch. I think people who play chess would probably really benefit from this kind of thing, but I think anybody would benefit from it because it will increase your concentration, and it will also help you use your concentration so that when unwanted thoughts arise, you can push them away in a very mature manner without judging them, without getting all tied up in them, without forcing them to repeat because you're trying to repress them as such in a negative way, but rather you're suppressing them in a way that is very, very conducive to freeing the field so that you just have the field. Now, another variation that you can do is get rid of the numbers and work with the alphabet. And one thing that I've taught over the years with great success is helping people memorize the alphabet backwards. It's really kind of shocking when you think about it and you try to say the alphabet backwards. I've met one person in my life who actually was like, yeah, of course I can do the alphabet backwards. And she said, I don't know why I can do it. And I said, well, go ahead and do it. She said, ZYXWVUTSRQPONMLKJIHGFEDCBA. I think I got that right. Sometimes I get my H and I backwards or forwards, as the case may be. In any case, she was able to do it. And I was just like, wow, how did you arrive at that? I don't know. I had to learn it. I had to use a memory palace to do it. But another more challenging thing would be to think about. So Z, X, V, etc. and go backwards skipping it, and then go forward skipping the parts that you didn't skip the last time. And it's basically a different version of the same thing, but it's a little bit harder when you do it backwards because most of us don't know how to say the alphabet backwards. So you could start by doing it with the alphabet forwards, which is still a bit of a challenge, A, C, E, G, etc. And then you think about how you could learn how to do it backwards, and you'll probably need to use a memory palace to memorize it backwards, but that's where getting something like the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass, or at least my free course at magneticmemorymethod.com/YT, will help you have a memory palace so that you can start to explore memorizing the alphabet backwards. Very, very powerful. And you can also do things like skipping the alphabet in this sort of structure of A, Z, B, Y, C, X, D, W, etc. And that is something that really stretches your mind when you first get started with that. And you can also do it the opposite way around. You can start in the middle of the alphabet and recite it all the way to the ends. And it's just going backwards and forwards really, really focuses your brain, gives you a lot to concentrate on. It's quite challenging, and it'll really help you study your own consciousness if you take that step of breaking it down. What is this thing called the alphabet? Now here's another little thing that you can do with the alphabet, which we'll call it the atomic alphabet exercise. So, one of the things that really influenced me when I was getting into memory techniques was reading Aristotle talk about how the alphabet is perfect for memory. It's one of the ultimate memory tools because it is so atomic. And what he meant is that the letter A is always the letter A. It's the smallest version of itself. If you can break it down, but if you break it down, it's no longer the letter A. So what you can do mentally is break it down. So think in your mind, close your eyes and think about the letter A, the capital A, and then take away that left down stroke. And what do you do with it? Well, you first of all picture it moving off, which leaves you with the right down stroke and a center line, and take that left stroke that's now floating in space and move it up and then have it rotate, or you can have it spin or what have you, but have it move all the way across the alphabet and then stick to the letter Z, as if the letter Z now has a tail at the bottom. Kind of a weird do alphabetical letter. It's not the letter Z anymore, it's something else. It's not the letter ZA because it doesn't have the full A there. But then on the back end of it, you could move the rest of the A over through your mind and then attach it to the end of this new Z half quarter letter A, and now you have something like a ZA letter because the Z now has an A tail structure. I don't know, maybe it's a Z on top of a strange pyramid, something like that. And you can do this with all of the alphabet. You can take a B and take its parts apart and place them around and see what happens if you take some of those circular parts of the letter B and attach them to the letter Y. And what happens if you take a C and try to integrate it somehow with the letter X. Maybe you now give the letter X a kind of a shield or something like this. Anyway, you can play with every single letter of the alphabet and break it down. And the more that you play around with this, the more you'll start to see the substance of what's called figural memory and how that figures are represented in consciousness. And they're very simple figures, but the more that you rotate them around, I think the more maybe it won't strengthen your figural memory. I don't know. I would love to have the budgets to study brain scans all about that. But it certainly, for me, has made my concentration and focus a lot stronger. And then when reading, it gives a better sense of, what the alphabet is and how to play around with it a little bit when we're using memory techniques. Because figural memory is quite interesting for memory techniques. If you can recombine letters, it makes it easier to, for example, learn foreign alphabets. Cyrillic, the Hansa, the Hiragana, the Katakana, you just have a much stronger sense of what to look for and how to look for it, and then how to combine the different letters in different ways so that they are memorable to you, because that's one of the great challenges of learning another language is how do you work with the alphabet? So give this exercise a try, this variation. Focus on the alphabet, break different letters down, and recombine them in different ways. And if you want a simple structure so you don't have to think about what letter to combine, just take the A and then make it go with the Z. Take the B and then go with the Y. And then take the C and then go with the X. ZYX, yeah. ZYX, WVUT, SRQ. And you just go that way. A goes to the last letter, B to the second last letter, C to the third to the last letter, etc. And then you don't have to think about what comes next. And then do it the opposite way and see how you can recombine all this stuff. And as with the previous exercises, if you find it a little bit too hard to do in your mind, start with a piece of paper and just draw it out, and then move as quickly as you can to doing it solely in your mind and learn to represent mental imagery mentally. Now, if you found all of this as challenging and rewarding as I have over the years, please make sure to hit that thumbs up. If you're new, subscribe, and let's take things to the next level if you're interested, because This can really, really go into places that allow you to memorize a lot better. When you take numbers and you associate them with consonants. So there's something called the major system, and it allows you to take the number 1 and associate it with something like a T or a D, or a D or a T, as you may prefer. And then 2 with an N, 3 with an M, 4 with an R, 5 with a L, 6 with a ch, j, sh sound, and 7 with a K sound. Some people use a hard G, and they might use a hard C for 7, and other people will use Y for 7, I've heard. And back to 3, some people will use an M, but also a W. 8, F or V, 9, B or P. And this is just one possible system. I'll tell you about another one in a minute. But I like the major a lot better. And it is just something that I might like a lot better simply because of a thing called the Primacy Effect, which is that we tend to favor things that we encounter first. And then once we've learned them, we become a little bit beholden to them. And like slaves in the world of Spartacus and the Matrix, we might even feel honored to defend them to the death because we're not aware of the production of the I, me. So, you might want to try that other one that I'm going to recommend in a second and see which you like first. And hey, you know what? The best of all possible worlds is potentially to have both, right? Anyway, this system, what it lets you do is to take any number that you might want to memorize and associate it in a way that lets you create words. So one thing that you can do with this, once you have the major system or the variation that I'll share in a minute, you can take a simple number. Let's say your seat number at the theater or on a train is 25 and you're tired. You're sick and tired of constantly looking at your ticket again and again and again to remember what your seat was. And so then you know the system. 2 is an N, 5 is an L. And so you make an image in your mind of a nail going through the seat that you're going to sit in. And then when you get on the train or you get into the theater, you can just go straight to seat 25 because you know that that nail in your imagination tells you that that's what that number was. I found this so useful throughout my life. It's amazing. It saves so much time. And yes, I use memory techniques because my memory is that bad. I will forget what my seat number was if I don't use these techniques. And I have spent much of my life in the brain foggy world that I inhabit looking at tickets again and again and again. I'm so glad that I'm done with that just by learning this simple system. So the major is incredible, and that's one way to use it. Now, if you really get into it, you can build something called a 00 to 99 PAO. So instead of thinking in your mind, okay, so I've got these 2 numbers, I know what my sounds are for each of the digits from 0 to 9, you will have built an entire system where you have an image for every 2-digit number from 00 to 99. So I do use nail from time to time still as a set number for 25, but I also use people who have names like Neil, right? So Neil Diamond, for example, is great, and he's much more specific than a nail. And to have Neil Diamond always for 25, and he's usually always having a nail drive through whatever it is that I'm trying to remember that's associated with 25, well, this is a person, Neil Diamond, and he's doing an action, which is nailing, and he's doing it with what? An object. A nail. So person, action, object. And if you have that fixed for each and every digit from 00 to 99, boom! You're going to be able to remember so many numbers so quickly. And it is an additional exercise just learning this and committing it to memory. But you don't have to commit it to memory if you use the major, right? Because the major is what you commit to memory. And it will always tell you what is the most logical word that you can use. And all you have to do is then push forward to make it more specific. Now, we've gotten off the rails here a little bit into just memorizing numbers for numbers' sake, and you might be wondering what the heck happened to the thought about getting rid of pain and suffering and ideas that you don't want tumbling into your mind. And I haven't forgotten all about that. I mean, if you're focused on memorizing numbers and you're focused on using these exercises, what problems do you have in the world to think about? You're thinking about the nature of representations in your mind by participating with them so deeply that you're stretching your mind in incredible ways that absolutely require so much focus and attention that not only can you have no ego, but when you have no ego, as Bruce Lee said, you have no problem. And you know, a good colleague of mine, Nelson Dellis, who also teaches memory techniques and is a multi-time winner of the USA Memory Championships, he featured one of my books, The Victorious Mind, and how that I talk about these ways of using focus and concentration to escape the self on his channel. And as he put it,
so for The Victorious Mind, I mean, there's a lot in here, and a lot of it is about memory techniques, which I don't need to go into, but I really like the overall message of this book, which is trying to develop this victorious mind, which is basically, as he summarizes in the end here, that it's almost this goal of having an absence of thoughts, but not quite, right? So he writes here, yet as I hope to have shown in this book, the absence of thoughts is not the goal of a victorious mind that wants to learn, remember, and participate in the world at the highest possible levels given the circumstances at hand. The world operates using many words, and this isn't going to change anytime soon. Even if achieving no mind is your goal, thought, as much as anything else, is what is likely to get you there. And he ends on this quote here by Wei Wu Wei. I don't know who that is, but why are you so unhappy? Because 99% of what you think and everything you do is for yourself, and there isn't one. I can relate because when training memory, right, which is such obviously a thoughtful process, it's all about thought, it's happening up here in your thoughts. When you get really good at memorizing things, there comes an effortless feeling sometimes when you're memorizing the best, when you're in the zone. And it's when you're not thinking, really, hard to describe, when you memorize the best. And I think that's that no mind kind of idea that he's talking about, is where you're obviously thinking, but you're not necessarily thinking about the thinking. Well worth the read. Love this book.
So I said I would share with you an alternative to the major system, which is something you might want to explore, and it is called the Dominic system. It's another way of filling your mind with a 00 to 99 PAO, and it's a variation on the major, another way of looking at essentially the same thing, but it's also different enough that, you know, you might want to have both going on in your mind, which would be an additional brain exercise, and an exercise that would keep you busy on the nature of your consciousness itself, by exploring your memory, becoming deeply involved with your memory to the exclusion of all else. So if you would like to be free from unwanted thoughts and have more brain exercise based on numbers and ways to skip numbers, which is essentially what you're doing. When you're memorizing something like pi, you are skipping all the numbers that don't belong to pi. So that's a great application of these techniques, another great brain exercise. And if you want that alternative, it's called the Dominic system, and those who use it, they sometimes call their population of figures from 00 to 99 Hotel Dominic. So if you'd like an overview of that, more grist for the mill in your brain exercises using numbers and skipping around multiple numbers, including the non-numbers that do not appear in pi, watch my video on the Dominic system next.